when you consider the essential elements of any novel, its building blocks, you'll talk in terms of plot, character, scenery and settings. You might talk about the central idea or image or genre. But one thing that's often overlooked is the concept of time. And yet time is essential to any novel. But the problem is that there are different applications of what we mean by time in a novel. So the first thing is, when is the novel set? What period? Is it a historical epoch? Is it set in your contemporary time of the writer, which of course within one generation will already be historical? Or is it something like science fiction that sets its action in the future? But there's a further application of time, which is how time moves through the book. Does all the action take place in one day, such as Ulysses or Mrs. Dalloway? Or is it a multi-generations family saga, which takes place over many, many decades, and at all points in between, obviously, as well? But there's yet a third application, which is how the novel is structured in terms of time. So, for example, does all the action proceed in a linear fashion, that it's sequential, there's no sort of jumping around between events? Or is it in fact non-linear, where you are moving between past, present and possibly future in the novel, based around the sort of characters' reflections on past events, or how memory intrudes, and all these things. So those are the three aspects of time within a novel. But it's not entirely sure what time itself is, how we define it. As Einstein showed that in certain cases, time is not fixed. You know, we take time as always proceeding in a forward direction, based on the notion of entropy, such as the erosion of cliffs at the sea, that they will only ever erode and the rocks fall into the sea. It can't happen the other way. Therefore, that is extrapolated to show that time is always moving forward, what's called time's arrow. But as I say, Einstein said, well, actually, you can stop time at the sort of near the speed of light, and that not only distorts time, it distorts space. Now, obviously, in our daily lives, that is not a factor, but it just goes to show that time itself is not fixed, is not a concept that we fully grasp. Indeed, there is an argument that, you know, time is entirely created by mankind. You know, concepts of the Big Bang, that time did not exist before the Big Bang. And it was only with the Big Bang and the creation of the universe that time was introduced. But, interestingly, for a writer, that statement that time did not exist before the Big Bang is contradictory, because the word before is a sequential, time-based word. So it shouldn't be in that sentence if you're talking about a time before time. And that's, you know, that sort of language's impact on how we conceive of time. But, you know, for all this sort of ambiguity, we writers have to still deal with time in our novels. And I look at different aspects of time in stories we tell our children. So, for example, there are two stories that deal with historical time. One of them is called Broken Shards of Pottery, where a student goes to university to study history and is so disillusioned by how history is created, because it's created not only by the winners of history, i.e. those who win wars and dominate other peoples. In the 20th century onwards, it's created by the academics. And it's created by the academics because, like the sort of literary canon, they determine the historical canon of truth. And they do this in a very sort of manufactured way, because they are contractually obliged to produce papers and books. And no one wants to read a book that just sort of rehashes the existing argument for a certain historical era and just sort of reproduces that. There's always this tendency either to offer something contradictory to the historical canon, or to open up a completely new seam of history. So history is sort of quite manufactured in that sense, quite artificial. And the character in Broken Shards of Pottery is increasingly sort of disillusioned by his experience of being taught history. And he's battling that against, you know, what literature offers, you know, what fiction offers. So that's one treatment of the past. The second is, there's a story called Lord of Misrule, which is about a Punch and Judy man who is sort of just, while he's sort of removed from the sight of the children as he's performing. You know, he's behind the curtain in his booth. He's sort of pontificating on how his audiences have changed over the generations in sort of severe contrast to the Punch and Judy act itself, which has, you know, survived many, many centuries, pretty much unchanged since the sort of Italian Commedia dell'arte. It's come down to us in a, as I say, a fairly unchanged form, even though there have been attempts sort of through political correctness to sort of nip and tuck at some of its imagery that's on offer. So there's that aspect where we, in our contemporary times, are changing and moving. I'm not going to say forward, you know, sometimes we're moving backwards, you know, not for the best. And yet you have this art form which has persisted throughout time, pretty unchanging. And how those two rub up against each other. Because Punch and Judy is still popular, kids still love it. And then I deal with future time, science fiction, which is a very, very rich genre in literature. But I think unfailingly one which always brings the readers back to the time in which the author was writing that science fiction novel, because science fiction novels, it seems to me, express the anxieties we fear in our own time, but projects them out into the future in order to analyse them, be it sort of techno fear, be it sort of geopolitical fear, and all these sorts of things. So although the books are written in the, you know, are set in the future, they absolutely take us all back to the, as I say, the time in which they were written. And I deal with that in a story called Kissing Cousins. And then the final one I've got is called A Briefing of Time's History, which obviously plays on Stephen Hawking's famous book, A Brief History of Time, where a twin has to write the eulogy for his brother who's just died, and is trying to sort of cast around into the life of his brother, which he doesn't really know much about because temperamentally they were so different. They didn't, as adults, they didn't really spend that much time together. And it's that thing of, you know, the history of, you know, great men and heroes and all this sort of stuff versus the history of the common man, the ordinary person, which very rarely gets, you know, any kind of spotlight, although of course in this sort of social media age and this age of sort of archiving of one's life and things like that, it is now more available. But it's that contrast between a life well lived and yet not well reported or preserved versus the sort of, you know, the inability to really penetrate someone else's life, even if you're a twin and therefore in theory very, very close to that person. So these are the different ways that I look at the notion of time in the novel.